I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got an interesting conversation today with Dr. Professor Jacqueline Murray. She called me up after I posted a interview with Dr. Thomas Varney about the challenge, the crisis of masculinity, and said, you know what, we should chat because she's got an interesting and potentially a different point of view on this topic. And she comes to it with a really interesting history. So Professor Murray is the University Professor Emerita of History at the University of Guelph. She's also an adjunct professor of medieval studies at the University of Toronto, a fellow at St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. And she's written and studied this topic in medieval times quite a bit. In 1999, she published a collection of essays entitled Conflicted Identities and Multiple Masculinities, Men in the Medieval West. In 2023, she published two collections, The Male Body and Social Masculinity in Pre-Modern Europe and The Patriarchy, Honor and Violence, Masculinities in Pre-Modern Europe. So she's studied masculinity through the ages. And then Dr. Thomas Varney, following up to a lot of commentary that's appeared particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, about the crisis of masculinity, about young men feeling lost and losing their identity and losing sort of a way of meaning. Dr. Murray said, let's talk. And so Dr. Murray, let's talk. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here, Brian. And I just thought I'd mention that it's not only that I have done a lot of work in the past, but also people have been debating this question for decades. Iron John, the book by Robert Bly, came out in 1990, talking about how were men ever going to have appropriate ways to express their masculinity. And Jordan Peterson writes about this quite a lot around the 2022, 23, and so on. And so we've got a lot of people that have been talking about this question for a long time. And it's really interesting because the question never really changes. They keep reiterating the same thing. Men are lost, men don't know how to be men. And in one sense, I think it's rather condescending. But in another sense, because men are individual human beings with their own identities and so on. And so to talk about a crisis of masculinity is such a broad generalization and encompasses everyone. But also, has it gotten worse? What are we doing about it? I don't know. I find it interesting about how now the statistics that people talk about, that men aren't going to universities. That's something that's been in the news quite recently. Yet when I looked at the statistics that were published, there are still more men in bachelor degree programs than there are women. There are still more men in college level programs than there are women. And while there may be a few more women professors and teachers, in fact, that is still dominated by men, the teaching profession at universities, not obviously at schools. So I think the statistics are being assessed in a kind of overwrought manner on one side. And on the other side, I think that there is a real situation for young men in particular today, that something has happened socially that is leading many young men to flounder and to be somewhat aimless. But I don't think it's a case that they're being displaced by women. Statistically, that's not correct, in particular because it's the same number of men as there's always been. It's just that the increased size of universities, for example, has allowed more female students to enroll than did in the past. So, uh,
So you're questioning this idea of a crisis of masculinity, and you're saying that the statistics that Thomas Varney and other people have quoted are wrong, where the proportion of females in post-secondary education is increasing dramatically, and the proportion of males in post-secondary education is decreasing. You question that statistic, and so that's
yes.
interesting. But at the same time, you're saying that there is this challenge that young men have. And the commentary that's been made, and it's certainly been made by lots of different people, including Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated last week, as a one other example, that too many men are feeling, particularly young men, are feeling lost, a sense of a loss of identity, a loss of meaning, a loss of purpose. Are you agreeing that they have that, or they don't have that?
No, I think that many young men do experience that. And I mean, it's almost a trope to talk about the young guy living in his parents' basement playing video games, not working, not going to school, just kind of being not even a burden, but maybe being a burden psychologically on himself. I don't know. I'm not a young man in a basement, but that's what we talk about.
So what's
And
the source of that then? What's the cause of that then?
well, I think that it's a circular cause, and uh, the young men are in their basement because they in their basement. If you can stand something that's almost like a syllogism, what are they doing in their basement? They're playing video games. What are those video games like? Well, let me tell you, Brian, they're not Pac-Man or Candy Crush. Those video games are uh, violent. They're uh, reinforcing an antiquated form of masculinity that popular culture believes comes from the Middle Ages. And so they're replicating a false Middle Ages in which men are men. And in these video games, they're all heteronormative, they're all physically robust to the point of being excessively muscular, even more than steroids would allow. They're violent, and they are seeking to dominate. And within these games, there are very few female characters, and those that are completely subservient, and they're either vaguely evil or hostile to whatever the man's mission is, or they're sexually subservient and are there just as sex symbols. And their presentation is, curvy, thin-waisted, breasts that defy gravity, and so on. So that these boys are playing these from childhood, in particular online, in particular if they're not being supervised by parents, which I think is often the case for even 10, 11, 12 boys, because of parents being so busy and the boys wanting their own space. So they're getting this message about what it is to be a man. There's the physical robustness, there's the violence, there's the seeking power, and then they're not doing that well in high school. We know that that is factually true. High school is not a happy place for boys. The proportion of them that do not excel is huge, and that's very sad. And they see that, and they can't go any further. Maybe they can only be laborers, and they're sitting in their basements feeling shame and feeling like they aren't real men because they're not fulfilling this faux medieval fantasy masculinity. And when I think about the crisis of masculinity, what I really wonder is it the crisis of patriarchal masculinity? And the fact that these antiquated, anachronistic notions of patriarchal masculinity, where men control everything, are being challenged at every turn in society, not only by women, but by the decrease, for example, of jobs that require physical muscle rather than the ability to run the robot. And so there's a lot of ways in which some young men's ego makes them feel like failures because they have been on these games that tell them what a man should be like, and they're not like that. And so it becomes a vicious circle.
So the problem is, number one, these video games, and number two, that these video games describe or copy a patriarchy, a patriarchal masculinity that you say is wrong, that didn't exist in the past. And that's fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages. And when we come back, I'm going to ask you to take that big step back and describe, if you could, what you think masculinity has been over the ages. Because what you said is that you've given a considerable thought to a long view of masculinity and how the past is a foundation for many contemporary ideas and the ideals of masculinity, but also that you said that there were misapprehensions about the past and how they feed this so-called crisis of masculinity. So this is going to be interesting, because what you're really doing is you're looking back into our history and you're seeing whether we had the masculinity that we think exists. Did it actually exist? Stay with us, everyone. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight. Back in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. This is going to be an interesting conversation tonight because I've got Professor Jacqueline Murray with us tonight. She's a university professor emerita in history at the University of Guelph. She's also an adjunct professor of medieval studies at the University of Toronto, and she's a fellow at St. Michael's College. And she asked to chat with me about a show that I did as a follow-up to an article written in the Globe and Mail by Dr. Thomas Varney, who is a psychologist, and he wrote about the crisis of masculinity. And she said that maybe there's a different point of view. And then she wrote me, which is interesting. You described several of the different essays and books that you've written about conflicted identities and multiple masculinities, men in the medieval West, and also two different collections that you wrote called The Male Body and Social Masculinity in Pre-Modern Europe and The Patriarchy, Honor, and Violence, Masculinities in Pre-Modern Europe. And then you said, so I have given considerable thought to a long view of masculinities and how the past is a foundation for many contemporary ideas and the ideals of masculinity. Wow. So tell me, Professor Murray, what is the long view of masculinity?
Well, the long view, and please note my earliest book title talked about identities and masculinities, plural. And that's something that's really important for us to realize, Brian, that there is no one way of being masculine. and having a masculine identity. And we see this quite carefully in the Middle Ages, where different social groups had their own definitions of masculinity. And these were tied to concepts that we don't think about very much in our own society. Concepts of honor, personal honor, which is about integrity, it's about self-worth, it's about having doing the right thing. The old saying, being a man of honor. And that was all internal. And we don't talk about men and honor very much unless it's defending their honor with violence. And even then, I don't know that the gangs and the drug dealers and so on think of themselves as defending their honor, but there's a sense in which it is. So in the Middle Ages, there were about 10% of men who were part of what we could in shorthand call the Knights in Shining Armor group. Or the other side of it is the violent, powerful men that dominated others. These are two sides of the same coin in that 10%. And both of them are fairly inaccurate because one is part of the Romantic Middle Ages and one is part of the gruesome Middle Ages, neither of which endured or actually occurred. But what about the other groups? So there were different types of masculinity and different types of honor that accrued to men in other social groups, in terms of merchants in towns, doing business with integrity and not charging interest and not cheating and not clipping the coins so that the coins weren't worth as much as they were supposed to be, this kind of thing. Merchants' honor and came from their masculinity and their perceived masculinity by society. And it could be for a wealthy merchant, a cobbler who was making, good shoes from good material. All of these men supporting their families and their households. Even Frodo the peasant out in the rural areas, who we think of as, from that Monty Python scene, kind of living in mud and so on. That wasn't true. Their masculinity was based in their ability to grow food, to pay the dues to the Lord, to be able to support their family, to be an honorable man who would be called upon to stand surety for his neighbors in court, this kind of thing.
So you're saying that this sort of very aggressive masculinity was only with the knights, which was, what'd you say, 10 or 15%, and that there was a fair amount of masculinity that was identified with interesting different terms, honor and provider and ethical.
That's absolutely ethical, I think, is very important there too. Yes, that's absolutely the case. Different masculinities to different social groups, even among the clergy, because masculinity so often is defined as having control of wives and children, yet even the clergy had a kind of masculine honor. Now, the thing about...
So you're saying, I apologize for interrupting. Did you say there, are you saying therefore that the patriarchy didn't exist?
No, absolutely. I'm not saying that by any means. Of course it existed, but it wasn't singular. Patriarchy acted itself out in different ways. Certainly, for example, in all of those groups that I just mentioned. Certainly, there would have been the belief that the man was the head of the household, but there was not the reductionism of women were either evil slaves or sex objects. Wives and women of all classes played an important part in society, both socially and economically, so that it was patriarchal and hierarchical, absolutely, but not what you see, it's misinterpreted as we go across the centuries, and you see how it's played out in what we call medievalism, the appropriation of the Middle Ages in a popular cultural setting that in fact makes the Middle Ages seem familiar, but in fact is only reinforcing contemporary values. So there's a lot of angst among men because women are working and doing this and that. But they did that in the Middle Ages too. But we don't get that.
Women worked in the Middle Ages?
Absolutely. You couldn't have a farm, a house, a business if you didn't have a wife that was working equally with you. It was not possible to make an economically viable household and living if you did not have a woman who was often in urban businesses, they kept the books and they dealt with the customers. Or in a peasant household, they had kitchen gardens, they helped with the fields, and they sold eggs and butter at the market.
But we've all watched Mary Poppins, when was that? That's when the suffragettes were just arguing for the vote, and females didn't get the vote in Canada until what, 1910 or something like that. The Equal Rights Amendment, pay equal work for equal pay. You go through all the lists. Are you saying that that's wrong?
No, I'm saying that women were doing all that work all that time, and it was unrecognized. And at some point, they wanted to demand more social equality and more opportunity. And part of that, at least I think in the late 20th century and this century, is due to the fact that men are not fulfilling their masculine roles as breadwinner, as father. And I think that at this point, I would agree with Mr. Varney that there is, in fact, quite a lot of shirking of those kinds of social and personal roles. But that is in part because it doesn't meet their expectations. We've got a society now where young men think that the road to success is on a basketball court, rapping, being business tycoons. It's not successful to be a good husband and father, to go to work every day, and to just have a life where you're not spectacular.
So you're saying we all want to be the knight. We all want to be the king. We all want to be this caricature of what masculinity was that we perceive in the Middle Ages of this very violent, aggressive, incredibly athletic. But that was only a small part of what masculinity was in the Middle Ages. That there were a whole bunch of other people that were shopkeepers and farmers that were, you're saying, honorable and providers and ethical and what, were not patriarchal?
Oh no, patriarchy doesn't have a lot to do with it. We're talking about masculinity and identity. And so they were recognized as masculine because they fulfilled all those expectations. I mean, one of the theorists, Gary Taylor, who studied masculinity in the early uh, 90s, uh, said, "Ma masculinity only exists if it's recognized by other men. So the female gaze within a household is not as important as the men around them recognizing them as men, and what that means within their level of society. A good family provider, honest person, and so on. And now we don't even value integrity that much. And in business, for example, and the role models uh, for young men, even financially, are people like uh, Elon Musk, or who is not, I don't think meets any kind of standard of male integrity.
But
And
he's a billionaire, if not a trillionaire. He's incredibly
that's
successful. He's got several wives, numerous kids from several different wives, etc. Isn't that the definition of success?
that's the problem, Brian. Too many people think that it is, and it isn't. It
Well,
is,
look at the President of the United States, several wives, children from several wives,
and
and
why
billionaire,
is that?
supposedly.
Why is that a standard of success other than money and the domination of others? That kind of, and that people now talk about toxic masculinity, but I would say is also the one that is related to the gruesome Middle Ages, where you see violence and domination. What has happened to good parenting, good fatherhood, being a provider for your partner and your children? That's not seen as important. I mean, these divorced rich men are anomalies in our society. What we need is a kind of a masculine identity to which all men can aspire. And I would say that that really uh, revolves around masculine honor and being doing the right thing, even if it doesn't benefit you, doing the right thing because you know inside yourself that it's the right thing to do. So
So
having a moral compass and
this masculine honor that you describe, whether it be today or in the Middle Ages, where does this come from? Does this come from the Bible, from religion, from culture? Where does it? We've lost it. It would appear. Where did it come from, and where does it come from?
you're right, a lot of it came from religion, but it doesn't have to. Religion up to say, uh, what, the 20th century. But as religion became less important in the lives of many people, nevertheless, there was a moral code of how people should behave, that you could do business with a handshake, that you could be reliable and counted upon. And that it has endured, and that's still a value in many areas uh, of life. But the need, uh, it takes work to do that. And it also does take a certain ethical education and an ethical society that reinforces fairness, following the rules, and so on. The fact that so few young boys are in organizations like Boy Scouts or uh, team sports, where they're taught to play by the rules, to do the right thing, to behave with integrity, is a real problem. Uh, you learn about that on a soccer field. You don't learn about it being the lone person shooting baskets on a basketball court because you think you're going to be in the NBA and then you're not, and you feel like a failure.
This is a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break for some messages. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with Professor Murray talking about masculinity over the ages, and is there a crisis in masculinity? And I guess you're saying that maybe there is a small amount of one in regards to young men that are losing their identity and being socialized by not Boy Scouts and soccer, but by video games in their basement. But really, what it is that we're misinterpreting what masculinity has meant in the past, and that we need to refine what the definition of masculinity has been, which has got something to do with honor and provider and ethical. And it would appear that you don't think that, frankly, other than the vote and paid work, that the perception that females were subservient is not right. That females in the past have not been subservient. That they played a very critical role, and that men have to recognize that. Hey, fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. I want to ask a little bit about. You made a comment about heteronormative, and you made a comment about sexuality, and you made a comment about physical appearance. I'm going to come back and ask you about that. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Professor Jacqueline Murray with me tonight. She's written some interesting books. The Male Body and Social Masculinity in Pre-Modern Europe. And the painting that I presume you've got on the cover of the book is a gentleman that isn't overly muscular. If anything, we might describe as almost effeminate. And then you've got another one, Patriarchy, Honor, and Violence, Masculinities in Pre-Modern Europe. And, some look pretty masculine and others look dressed up like no one would dress today. You made a comment about that we have this perception that everyone was very athletic. And then you said you had this perception that everyone was heteronormative. What do you mean by all that?
Well, first of all, we see, let's talk about physique first. And physique is in many ways something men can't, completely control. They can go to the gym and lift 1,000-pound weights, or they can take steroids or whatever. But really, it's what it's what you're created with. It's your genetic makeup. It's your biology. But if we look at the role models in some of these video games, but also I think even in cartoons and certainly in movies, you get the heroes being so overly muscled that they can hardly move, and they're the ones that are going to save society or whatever and defeat the evil power. And they're so big that their heads look like little pinheads because of their big, huge shoulder muscles. And that's a crazy ideal to have. And so, but it's being presented in multiple areas that physical prowess, big muscles, the ability to fight and win, to dominate physically is the ideal. And I think that if we look at how this plays out, it explains some of the violence we see committed by young men who are at the biggest risk of going out, selling drugs, buying guns, being in a gang. They're acting out on the streets of cities, this notion of medieval warfare that they see in these video games. And that's, because that's how they think men behave, and that's a sense of self-worth. The other thing about the perception of the Middle Ages that is found in these appropriations in video games and elsewhere is this idea that all men are heterosexual and they conform to the norms of heterosexual masculinity, which usually means having sex with a lot of women, having a lot of children to prove that you've got good, strong semen, having more boys than girls if you can possibly swing it. And this is seen in the video games where there are very few female characters, and when they are, they're all those sexy women that the men get to. I mean, the roles of women in some of these games are prostitute, courtesan, or witch. Um, so, uh, this idea that men sexually dominate women and have control, not just of one woman, but many women, is being uh, absorbed through these video games. And then you see, in fact, a reinscribing of patriarchal masculinity. And we see it in the conservative right wing right now in our neighbor to the south, where state after state is trying to control women by reducing their access to abortion, and where some of these right-wing groups, headed by both men and women, are saying women should be at home being housewives and so on. So trying to bring back, in this case, a glorious view of the 1950s with women as housewives. And the other thing is, these games present a sexual binary. There's men who have sex with women and the women that passively accept sex from men. You don't see gay characters, gender queer characters, and so on. So that because of that, it's seen that men are all heterosexual. And this leads to, again, some of the anti-gay and anti-trans legislation we see being enacted because it's reinscribing this idea that there's only one way to be a man and one sexuality.
So what are you saying? That in the Middle Ages there was homosexuality, there was trans people?
Absolutely. Yes to both of those.
How
And
do you know that? How do you know that?
because we've got records that show that. Historians go back and they read things like court cases or chronicles or even saints' lives. One of the biggest group of people in the early Middle Ages who were transgendered were actually also saints. And they took
Why would
on,
transgendered people be saints?
because they took on the good, holy characteristics of the other sex and denied uh, the body. We see in cases from the 14th and 15th century, not saints, but real people, women dressing like men and living like men who actually dressed like women and were arrested for prostitution and so on, and would give in court their female name and say that they identified as female. We've got other examples of men who had sex with men describing how they had sex, which was not what we all think of as gay, anal intercourse. It was different types of sex that also involved emotion and affection. And there was asexual homoaffective relationships across society for both men and women, where their primary focus and emotional relationship with someone of the same sex. So there were multiple sexualities in the Middle Ages, but again, popular culture now has suppressed that knowledge and fights against that knowledge.
Certainly, there's been lots of movies and different things that describe ancient Greek society that would suggest that homosexuality was accepted or part of society. So, are you saying that homosexuality or trans people were more accepted or less accepted, or just there and and part of existence?
Just there. They were transgressive, absolutely. Uh, if caught, they would be taken before the courts, unless they were the one of the saintly group. But um, it was a binary system where men were men and women were women in theory and in law, but that doesn't mean that that's how people lived. And so we only see that kind of legalization and that binary of creation in law and the church when we look at the Middle Ages, and we don't see its more complicated and refined aspects. And so this then reinforces the submission of women, the passivity of women, women in the home, and that this, if this is not the case, men are threatened.
So,
And they
so
don't
some of
need to
the,
be.
go ahead, I apologize.
I was just going to say, and they don't need to be threatened by that.
So some of the criticism from the right and from people that are really worried about where this crisis of masculinity has come from criticize the women's movement, criticize women's liberation, criticize the pill, abortion, divorce as ways that have broken up. I don't know whether it's the patriarchy or the family unit, but given women a lot more power to control their bodies, control reproduction, and they would say that women's liberation went too far. What do you think of that?
I think that, and they used to call it in the 1990s, they called it men's liberation. And really, I think that men should attend to themselves rather than spending their time controlling women so they can feel good about being masculine. That if men had the same inner strength, the same uh, built a sense of identity that was not based on unreachable kinds of goals like being a professional athlete, and instead played pickup ball on Saturday and went to work Monday or Friday and supported their children and supported their partner, that they would get an intrinsic sense of self-worth at whatever social level they lived. We all don't have to have social mobility. We all don't need university degrees. It's as honorable to be a plumber as it is to be a business tycoon. If you have that sense of worth and you are an honorable man and have integrity.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is we need to redefine masculinity. Let's take a break and come back with some final comments. And I'm going to ask you how and into what do we redefine masculinity? Stay with us, everyone. This is really interesting. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm having a really interesting conversation with Professor Jacqueline Murray, who's written a lot of books about the Middle Ages and about male sexuality and and masculinity in the male in the Middle Ages. And after I aired an interview with Dr. Thomas Varney about the crisis of masculinity, and he wrote a really interesting article in the Globe and Mail about it, she said maybe we should talk about it because there's some incorrect perceptions we have of masculinity in the past. Um, so, it is interesting that you mentioned Jordan Peterson, who has talked about how we need to redefine masculinity and talked about honor and provider, which a lot of people reacted negatively to the word about provider, but the idea that provider was a key part of what masculinity he thought needed to be sort of redefined as. There's a business school professor in the United States called Scott Galloway who's talked about this a fair amount as well about provider, family man, ethics, etc. Charlie Kirk, who used religion as a way of defining a different style of masculinity, frankly, also a different style of femininity that was, as you said, staying at home and a 1950s definition potentially of females. So what do we do if we've got this crisis? And at the same time, as you did admit that the right wing has become attractive to a lot of young men, and they are appealing to these young men that feel lost and are you called it a trope, but living in their parents' basements, playing video games, and not having losing a sense of who they are, a sense of identity, a sense of meaning. So, given this situation that you're saying that masculinity has been misunderstood in the past, and today we're having this toxic masculinity that is being described as positive or attractive or something that people might want to admire and emulate, whether it be President Trump or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or other people. And your comment about females that have breasts that defy gravity, a lot of them are attracted to those females that have breasts that defy gravity. What's the solution in your mind? Because I think you're admitting that while you're questioning some of the statistics, some of that does exist.
And I would say that some of it exists because of this false perception of the past and what real men were like. And I I believe, Brian, that one of the most dangerous aspects of all of this is through social media and the way that social media pulls in young men and feeds their discontent. And they go into these chat rooms and are recruited not only to a patriarchal view of the role of men and women, but also to the far right, to radicalism, to conservative radicalism. And the social media has a big role, and I don't know how we tame it, but I think we must. And I think that we need to start reinforcing in young men self-worth. A lot of incels, as it were, they say that they can't get a girl to go out with them. And when you see photographs of them, or even see half the guys that are on the streets or the campuses, they're unkempt, they haven't washed their hair in a week, they're disheveled, and what woman would want to go out with them? I think one of the reasons that our last federal election was such a landslide is because Mr. Carney came on the stage dressed in a suit and tie, spoke in moderate tones, and suddenly people thought, my God, there's an adult in the room, instead of all the yelling and vilifying and so on. And I'm not talking about his politics now. I'm talking about his presence. When I started university, all my professors wore a suit and tie. You'll not find a suit and tie anywhere in the university classroom now. People have to portray and be role models for young men and show them how to behave, to take pride in their presentation, to take pride in themselves, to learn a game of sports that has rules that can be followed and not try and elbows up, as it were, and to really reinforce integrity. And it's going to take a long time, but the worst is how to get young men off social media, off their cell phones, and the longer they're off cell phones in school, the better. But to lever them out of these basements and into team sports and into training programs and apprenticeships and so on. I think that we have overplayed university education and that we need to refocus on doing the job that's right for you, not being forced into something that's an uncomfortable fit. And I'll tell you, I always appreciate the plumber that comes and saves me when my faucet is leaking, much more than I appreciate yet one more MBA on Bay Street. I think we have to allow men to take pride in varieties of masculinities, as in the past.
So if you had to define, I guess I'll call it positive masculinity rather than toxic masculinity, what would be some of the words you would use? It sounds like it is a provider, it is ethical, it is a variety, accepting of a variety of different descriptions of masculinity. What else?
Honor, being a person of honor that will do the right thing even if no one's looking. So honor and integrity, but also self-worth, and not self-worth in pridefulness or ambition, but a sense of the internal person being worthy and knowing that he is living out a masculinity that is good and strong and appropriate for him.
Professor Jacqueline Murray, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This has been an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Guelph, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, on social media, on my YouTube channel, and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody. Thank you, Professor Murray. This has been great.